Welcome to Warping Fist.
How many more bones will you crush? How many lives will you destroy in pursuit of what you call justice? You are the product of everything you fear. Violence, darkness, helplessness. All that remains is for you to watch as I drag your beloved Gotham into oblivion.
Although its early controversies overshadowed its genuine quality content, Batman Arkham Knight continues to captivate players long after its release due to its seamless integration of cinematic storytelling, immersive gameplay, and technical prowess. Set in a visually stunning rendition of Gotham City, made possible through next-gen technology, Rocksteady used the new tools available to them to extensively expand upon the formula created in Batman Arkham Asylum. The game's narrative depth, coupled with its fluid combat mechanics, dynamic stealth, and innovative Batmobile gameplay, offer a truly cinematic experience that keeps players engaged from start to finish. Batman Arkham Knight remains a standout experience in the gaming landscape, which will likely never see replicated ever again. However, with such a high quality product that's used as a benchmark for many other action-adventure games even today, it makes one wonder how Rocksteady managed to create such a high quality product. Let's take a look at the early development of Batman Arkham Knight, its interesting cut mechanics, the artistic development of Gotham City, and the many pieces of cut content that never made it into the final product.
That is very good. You'll need that to solve my little game.
Breaking news, Gotham's underworld is terrorized by the brutal Red Hood. Stay
Overtime?
tuned for the latest details.
Overtime!
A lot more bad guys are about to rest in peace.
Now, when it comes to the history of Arkham Knight, there's not much to discuss. Batman Arkham Knight is the third game in Rocksteady's Batman trilogy. While Batman Arkham Asylum and Batman Arkham City were released 2 years apart due to their smaller scope, Arkham Knight took 4 years to develop in comparison, a testament to the time and effort it took to put the game together. When you take a look at Rocksteady's previous 2 Arkham games, there's a notable progression in the ambition and scale of the project, with each new subsequent title increasing the overall scope. After the release of Batman Arkham City, obviously Rocksteady would have to somehow outdo themselves yet again. However, with the current console technologies at the time, there was no way they'd be able to craft a worthy successor. So instead of restricting their vision for the Arkham City sequel, Rocksteady would instead decide to develop their new title for the next generation consoles. This way, they'd be able to achieve their grandiose vision and implement as many complicated mechanics they could think of. Unfortunately, this meant that it would take a long time to put this game together, creating a huge gap between Arkham City and this new game. Luckily for fans who could not handle the wait, WB Montreal was developing their own Arkham game that would be released in between. There's a clear evolution in the design of Gotham City in every Arkham game. In Batman Arkham Asylum, Gotham City was simply a backdrop shown in the distance. We never visit it and were forced to view it from afar through limited cutscenes. In Batman Arkham City, players were finally able to explore the location, well, at least a portion of it, With the enhanced capabilities of the newer gen consoles, Rocksteady were able to craft a brand new Gotham City we've never seen before. Gone were the far-off backdrops or the enclosed and claustrophobic streets of Arkham City. Now players could explore a huge open-world metropolis packed full of content to experience. Batman Arkham Knight contained its open world within 3 distinct islands: Bleak Island, Founders Island, and Miyagani Island. While it would have been easy to make each island nearly identical to each other, only serving as empty space to travel to new missions, Rocksteady borrowed from their approach with Arkham Asylum and Arkham City. Each island, much like the districts from Arkham City or the wards from Arkham Asylum, had their own distinct aesthetic to bring visual variety to the map. It genuinely feels as if people had lived here, and there's a clear sense of history within the city. Gotham City in Arkham Knight is visibly newer and more advanced than what we've seen in the older games. Lights proliferate the skyline, the buildings look newly built, and take on more diverse sets of architectural styles. Neo-Gothic would be a great way to describe how the city looks. In fact, just take a look at some of the landmarks within the map. Much like Arkham City, you can often tell where you are based on the structures around you, especially the landmarks like the giant red Eiffel Tower-like building, Wayne Tower with its vibrant logo in the distance, Ace Chemicals, the movie studios, the lighthouse, and the GCPD with its vibrant blue lights. Now you know what I mean by Neo-Gothic. It's a city that appears brand new on the surface until you realize that the blinding neon lights are basically engraved into the old and Gothic architecture. It's a strange paradoxical utopia which can't decide which time period it exists within, especially when you see the billboards, which look like something straight out of the 1960s. The only exception is Founders Island, which is filled with brand new buildings, towering skyscrapers that blind the viewer with their neon glow. However, Founders Island isn't much different from the rest of the city. They just do a better job hiding their Gothic roots, as beneath the city you can find another society within, one more dilapidated and abandoned in its appearance.
Hey, I know an ugly skyscraper when I see one. Besides, have you been down there, on the underside? It's creepy. All those abandoned shops and empty alleys.
The contradictory nature of Gotham's appearance in Arkham Knight was on purpose, as the developers wanted a mix of old architectural styles from the past, with influences rooted in Art Deco. Just take a look at some of the conceptual art for Gotham City, which demonstrates this the best. Gotham City in the art appears like a dark, dystopian metropolis. The buildings are drawn to be bleak and unassuming, but also with blinding lights shooting out from their structures, the only evidence that they're present within this dark and gloomy world. The city appears grand, but also oppressing at the same time. The city is open and spaced out, but for some reason, you feel like you have to stay hidden, as if there's some kind of force compelling you to the shadows of the city, as if it's some kind of Orwellian nightmare. And isn't that exactly what Gotham City is? A city that tries to look grand, tries to appear affluent and safe, but there's a clear dark undertone, a sinister nature hidden underneath its large and grand buildings. Although whimsical, there's a feeling that something is amiss, as if the grand appearance is to hide something more sinister within every block. The only real substantial difference between the artwork and the final game is both the atmosphere, as overall I'd say the art is a bit more scary visually, especially when you see the look of the militia, who look like a shadowy organization you'd see in a dystopian novel. I'd say the art is a bit more fantastical looking as well, but still maintaining that heavy, oppressive atmosphere. And I'd say the final Gotham City doesn't look that different from the artwork, maybe a bit more toned down for the purpose of optimization. In my video on Arkham City, I mentioned how due to the size of the map, the developers could create a curated experience where the open world was essentially handcrafted to encourage exploration. Because the map was small, you could tell where every landmark was simply by viewing your surroundings. And thanks to the assortment of Easter eggs, unique side missions, and creepy occurrences, it encouraged players to explore the map thoroughly for every secret hidden within. With Arkham Knight, however, which introduced a massive new map, the curated nature of Arkham City could no longer be possible. This is seen with how the enemy encounters have been tweaked. You see in Batman Arkham Asylum and Batman Arkham City, enemy placement on the map is actually scripted. Every time you see a placement of enemies in an area, they were actually placed there by hand in order to fill up the map with NPCs. That's why no matter how many times you boot up the game, the same enemies will always respawn around that particular spot. However, with Arkham Knight, hand placing enemies around different points of the map would be time consuming. So in an effort to save time, the developers came up with a new dynamic system for the enemy AI. Instead of being placed in one spot, enemies could actually walk around and engage in different activities, causing riots, racing around in cars, and just generally exploring the areas they're in. This change helps the world feel alive instead of a scripted sequence of events. The developers were so dedicated to the player's immersion that they created hundreds of fake brands to sprinkle throughout the map. Some stores are ripped straight from DC lore, but many of them are also made up as well. Of course, when you're making a game as large and as ambitious as Arkham Knight, there's bound to be a large variety of content that gets cut from the game and never fully utilized in the project for whatever reason. There's of course many artistic works that depict certain areas a bit differently from the game, maybe a bit more grand than we're used to, and some even make them more eerie and claustrophobic. One of these areas, with a radically different design approach, is Panessa Studios, depicted in this artwork. Now the location almost looks identical to how it appears in the final game, at first glance at least, but what you'd likely take notice of is the villain Clayface, who seems to be climbing onto a tower on the building, screaming into the night. Now at first glance, this does indicate that a Clayface boss was present early in the game, where Batman would have to confront the character here for whatever reason. Unfortunately, the Clayface you see here is actually a statue and not the actual character. It seems like whoever built this statue did it to pay homage to Basil Carlo. This statue would never be brought over into the final game, but a reference to Clayface may still exist. If you travel to the outskirts of Panessa Studios, you can find an empty room filled to the brim with several props and film equipment. Now clearly this room is a prop room of some kind, either for a film, play, or TV show. It's not entirely clear why this room exists. There's no Riddler trophies or even audio files to be found here, but as far as we know right now, this room is simply an Easter egg to one of Batman's most famous villains. Another piece of side content cut from the game involved Black Mask and the character Prometheus, likely a part of the Season of Infamy DLC. Not much is known about these two's roles in the game, but what we do know is that Black Mask would be reused for the Red Hood DLC pack, while Prometheus would be cut from the game entirely. Victor Zsasz originally had his own dedicated side mission in the game, but for whatever reason, it was cut from the final product. There's actually a ton of evidence that the character did indeed have a side mission, including remnants of his side mission in the open world, where you can find a group of criminals creepily standing together. Upon scanning them, you realize they're actually dead, and you also discover a riddle left behind by Victor Zsasz. The objective of the Zsasz side mission would have likely involved the player tracking down a plethora of strangely posed victims, and perhaps we'd even have to do an autopsy, similar to the Professor Pig side mission. By scanning enough of these victims, you'd eventually pinpoint his location and confront him.
Ever held a razor to your wrist, Batman? Allow me the pleasure.
More evidence pointing towards a cut side mission is the unused character portrait found within the game files that was clearly created using Arkham Knight's game engine, and a series of unused dialogue from the character also exist within the game.
I see it, Batman. In their eyes. The terror of futility. Nothing we do matters. Death is our release.
According to lore details provided by Batman and Aaron Cash within cut audio dialogue, it seems as if nobody knew Zsasz had returned to Gotham City.
You're way ahead of us, Batman. We didn't even know that psycho was back in town.
Zsasz. He'll regret coming back to Gotham.
There's a rumor that the Zsasz side mission was replaced by the Professor Pig side mission, perhaps implying that the missions were similar in structure. According to this video, posted by the account Osipus33 on YouTube, the Zsasz voice lines were even dubbed into several languages, which indicates just how far Rocksteady developed the character.
Ich sehe ihn, Batman. In Ihren Augen. Den Schrecken der Vergeblichkeit. Nichts ist von Bedeutung. Der Tod erlöst uns.
Alfred, I've lost contact with the Batmobile. Activate the emergency tracker.
This is becoming a rather expensive habit. It appears to be moving away from your position, sir. May I suggest you catch up with it sooner rather than later?
According to this in-game dialogue, at some point in the game, the Batmobile would get stolen, requiring Batman to track it down. Almost no information exists about what exactly is going on in this sequence. This could be a cut side mission or a main mission, but as far as right now, we can only speculate on the context. Within the game files of Arkham Knight, players discovered a model for what appears to be a gas mask. The gas mask was a part of Batman's suit originally. The mask would supposedly be worn by Batman in intoxicated areas, and there's supposedly an animation of him putting it on.
So introducing such a beast or a character like the Batmobile wasn't easy for us. Like, I spent about a good 2.5 years kind of working on that day in, day out, and the guys again still are just cracking on and trying to finish that off.
Now, why did Gotham City look this way in Arkham Knight? It sounds like a dumb question, sure, but it's a legitimate thing to ask. Arkham City had a very particular look to it. Why didn't they take what worked in Arkham City and just expand it to a larger size, keeping the damaged and claustrophobic streets and all the city's charm? But that's the thing. What worked in Arkham City, what made Arkham City special, could not have possibly worked here, especially since Rocksteady was hoping to add a very particular and famous part of the Batman mythos into the game. Rocksteady had always wanted to add the Batmobile into the Arkham series. However, due to technical limitations, they were never able to implement it into the game, being restricted to cutscenes or a static vehicle model. When Batman Arkham Knight finally entered development, the studio had the opportunity to bring this iconic vehicle into the game. When Rocksteady were first developing the Batmobile mechanics, they needed to figure out how it would be incorporated into the traditional Arkham gameplay. In order to test out the Batmobile's mechanics, the developers placed it into the Arkham City map, and here they came across their biggest issue. The Batmobile was not fun to use. More specifically, the Batmobile wasn't fun to drive within the Arkham City map. This is because the Arkham City map was much more tight, claustrophobic, and damaged. so the developers struggled to maneuver the Batmobile through the streets. Okay, it was clear then that the world design present in Arkham City would not be viable if they wanted to use the Batmobile. So as a result, the level designers decided to redesign Gotham from the ground up with the purpose of crafting a city that the Batmobile could fully explore. The streets were made to be larger and wide, with destructible environments to allow for more seamless driving. Due to the higher graphical fidelity of the newer gen consoles, certain things that worked in the earlier games could no longer be used in Arkham Knight. The Batsuit was one such element, as the developers felt that the suit looked too plain and boring when compared to the world Batman inhabited. So as a result, they redesigned the Batsuit to look more aggressive, and what better way to do it than to model it after the new aggressive looking Batmobile design. So clearly Rocksteady had done everything in their power to improve the traversal systems in Arkham Knight, and even went out of their way to make gliding and grappling feel faster, with improved controls and the seamless chaining of animations to make sure the players could keep their momentum at all times. Speaking of seamless transitions of animations, the combat very much embraced this aspect of the game.
I mean, I think the controls themselves are pretty tight. I think adding more things you can do is something that we're always looking at, and it is difficult in the sense that, you know, the combat system, the Predator system are fairly well refined and they've all been very well reviewed, and you don't want to change that because people are used to that, but you want to add to that system. So we've worked on adding to those, but without making them more complicated, so players can come in and play at the level they were playing at before. But if you're an experienced Arkham player, you'll be able to try all the new moves that are in there, the fear takedowns to take down multiple enemies at once, new combat moves. Like, it's quite easy to add new, more complicated enemy types, but how many players are going to get to experience that? We wanted to add things to that kind of base experience, so that's why we have kind of charging enemies, being able to steal weapons off people, and things that every player can do, like almost right from the start of the game. Throw counters, you know, it's things that really affect that kind of core experience without overcomplicating it as well.
Combat doesn't go through an overhaul in Arkham Knight, but there are some new additions to spice things up, like dual team combat, where players can switch between characters and perform special takedowns. There's also grab attacks, requiring the player to quickly button mash as an enemy grabs you before you take damage, which was likely a feature borrowed from Batman Arkham Origins, as a certain enemy type had the ability to grab the player. These new mechanics and many others added onto the game play into Rocksteady's goal of improving the animations and transitions of the free-flow combat system. The combat has a bigger emphasis on flow and the seamless chaining of combos together to ensure you're always on the move. In fact, the animations never feel janky or nonsensical. It truly feels as if Batman is naturally using these maneuvers during combat, chaining between them naturally. This helps the combat system feel addictive, as it really incentivizes players to keep their movement going, but it also gives the combat a cinematic flair that very few games manage to achieve. In order to improve the flow and rhythm of the combat system, certain combat mechanics in the older games have been adjusted. All combat options are now multi-purpose and can be chained through more seamlessly. For example, in every Arkham game before night, when you knock an enemy to the floor, there are only two options to take them down right after. You can either perform the traditional knockdown, or you could perform a multi-takedown combo move. In Batman Arkham Knight, you now have two more options to deal with a downed enemy. You can either attack them while they're still on the ground, as Batman automatically pounds onto them until they're knocked down. or you could pick them up off the ground and instantly transition into a beatdown. These new additions mean that the players now have 4 different ways to deal with a grounded enemy. There's also a new move enemies can use, and this is the charge attacks, visualized by a red indicator. These moves involve the enemy charging towards the player and tackling them to the ground. This mechanic was likely borrowed from Batman Arkham Origins once again, where the brute enemy type could use a similar maneuver, picking the player off the ground and slamming them to the floor. However, in the game, players had limited ways to deal with the move, either dodging out of the way or quickly button mashing to free themselves early. However, in Batman Arkham Knight, there's one additional way to deal with a charging enemy. If players are fast enough, they can instantly take out a charging enemy with a batarang, or just jump over them like normal. Another multi-purpose move was the throw. In Batman Arkham Asylum, the throw was a special combo move that wasn't really that useful. However, in Batman Arkham Knight, the throw has been turned into something called the perfect counter, where if the player counters just before a hit, Batman will throw the enemy, which has a chance of staggering ones nearby. This allows throws to seamlessly be integrated into the counter mechanic, which for the longest time was a very simple feature, but now has several purposes. The explosive gel quickfire gadget has been tweaked in the game as well, which when exploded disorients them and causes them to attack other NPCs, much different from the other Arkham games. The final tweaked move is the cape juggle, which ends with Batman kicking the enemy away, which is pretty different from the other games, where cape juggling was only useful for special mini-bosses. Besides these new multi-purpose moves, the game also adds a variety of new special combo moves, like the explosive batarang, the grapple hook takedown, the massive explosive gel blast, and whatever this move is supposed to be. The game also increased combat variety through the use of the environment. Players could either use a plethora of flashy environmental takedowns or using the mini weapons sprinkled throughout the battlefield, which much like the shock gloves from Batman Arkham Origins that bypass the defense and special skills of enemies. Weapons in Arkham Knight accomplish the same thing, but much more balanced. If a player picked up a weapon, they could damage an enemy regardless of their defense or special combat abilities. However, weapons were capable of breaking, and there was a limited amount of them on the battlefield. Besides Batman's new tricks, the game featured a variety of new enemy types that would spice up the combat. The brutes, which were likely borrowed from Batman Arkham Origins, replaced the armored enemies from the previous games and basically behave in the same way. Interestingly, although brutes replaced the armored enemies, the latter may have still made it into the game early on. This is the militia checkpoint commander, and he seemed to behave similarly to an armored enemy in the previous games. Medics have the ability to revive enemies on the battlefield, making them a prime target for the player. They can also electrify enemies, which makes them impossible to touch. Ninjas make a return in Batman Arkham Knight. They behave a bit differently from the previous Arkham games, with a few new maneuvers we've never seen before, especially in the Ra's al Ghul DLC. What's interesting is that Arkham Knight had even more enemy types that unfortunately did not make it into the game. There was the Firefly Thug, who dons a yellow firefighter looking outfit, a gas mask, and a jetpack. The characters seemed to wield a flamethrower of some kind, giving us an idea on how their fighting style would have been like. We can't actually be sure that this enemy type would have been used in combat. It's entirely possible that he was an enemy type used for pursuit missions, similar to the Firefly side mission. Another unused enemy type was the Chain Lieutenant, who would have been a part of the militia. Based on his design, the Chain Lieutenant would have been similar to a brute enemy type, which means they take longer to take down, and their attacks cause more damage. In terms of attacks, the character would have likely swung his chain at Batman either to bind him or hit him with a high impact attack, requiring you to dodge or use a counter. I contacted Can Muftik, the artist behind these designs, to figure out the context behind them, and according to him, these unused enemies were created by him as a sort of pitch to Rocksteady. He had many ideas in terms of how they'd be implemented into the gameplay, but unfortunately, artists don't really have a say when it comes to gameplay mechanics, so these proposed enemy types never made it past the concept stages. Surprisingly, there isn't a lot of concept art for characters in the game, which makes sense considering that their looks were pretty established already in the Arkham series. There is one interesting piece of art worth talking about, however. Within the files of Batman Arkham Knight, this image can be found of a man who appears to be wearing raggedy and stitched together Ace Chemicals clothing and a full-on gas mask of some kind, which appears to be cracked and crudely stitched together. Now, who is this character supposed to be? Well, based off the file name, this is an early design for Scarecrow. This is of course a radical departure from how the character typically looks and lacks any of Scarecrow's motifs, so it makes sense why this design was never used in the final game. Did you know that the Arkham Knight as a character wasn't originally present? Despite the heavy marketing push for the character, he was not always intended to be the central antagonist of the game. Well, it's not as if the character himself was not in the game, but more like the alias of the Arkham Knight was something that wasn't always set in stone. Jason Todd's Red Hood was originally supposed to be the villain in the game, so just imagine every cutscene and marketing material involving the Arkham Knight and replace it with the Red Hood instead, and this basically represents the character's original role. This interesting information puts things into perspective. 1. It explains why the militia take on a primarily red color palette. This is made even more clear when you take a look at some early concept art and in-game models, where you can actually see the Red Hood logo on the militia's uniform, showing that this was the group's logo. The Red Hood logo can also be seen as tattoos within some early concept art, showing you just how far back this idea went. It's unclear why they changed the Red Hood into the Arkham Knight, but if I had to guess, they wanted to make the marketing material more exciting. Remember, during the promotions of Arkham Knight, the character's identity was one of the biggest selling points of the title, with Rocksteady attempting to have people speculate on the identity of this character. It was really obvious who it was, but I guess A+ for trying. When it comes to the stealth mechanics, the overall formula remains the same as every previous Arkham game, with no significant deviations or overhauls. However, Rocksteady did add a few new elements to flesh out the feature a bit more. For one thing, the enemy AI has been vastly improved, as they can now employ several new tactics to make the stealth harder, such as alerting others if they find an open vent, using explosives to lure Batman out of vents, throwing explosives on gargoyles and rails to hinder your movement. When a medic is about to revive a downed enemy, one enemy sticks close and keeps watch. The enemies are also now armed with new tools to make stealth a bit more difficult, such as cloaking suits, which hide them from detective vision, GPS locators that can track you using detective vision,
This doesn't make any sense. It says he's right behind me.
and finally drone operators who can operate drones that take you out instantly. Let's not even mention the other plethora of autonomous devices. Luckily, Batman is also given a variety of new skills to even the odds, including new gadgets Now, there's not much cut content from the stealth mechanics in most Arkham games, but interestingly, Arkham Knight did include a few interesting gadgets that never made it into the game. There's about one notable cut gadget that would have played a part in the stealth sequences. The gadget was called the Fear Dart, and as the name implies, Batman could fire it at an enemy, which would cause them to freak out and start shooting their gun, which would then startle the other enemies around. It's unclear why this gadget was cut, but if the gadget's purpose was to lure enemies to another area, the voice synthesizer could already do that and much more. When Rocksteady were developing the Batmobile into the game, they did not want to treat it as a simple mode of transportation. Instead, they strived to implement the Batmobile into the general gameplay, as the developers saw it as one of Batman's most important gadgets. Tank battles were the most controversial element of Batman Arkham Knight, not because they are poorly done, as the mechanics are pretty well put together, with fights I'd say are pretty fun to play. No, the reason for the complaints was the sheer amount of them in the game, which players felt took attention away from the game's other strengths. This would not have been such a significant complaint if tank battles had more of an extensive variety of enemy types to deal with. Unfortunately, no matter how much I looked, I couldn't find much content regarding this gameplay mechanic. Although tank battles don't have much content, pursuit missions offered something more interesting. Vehicle pursuits involve Batman chasing an APC until you crash them. The only opposition you face during these sequences is other militia vehicles that attempt to shoot you and ram you off the road. However, pursuits may have featured a new enemy type during the game's early development. This was called the Suicide Pursuit Drone, and based on the design and rocket booster attached to the back, the purpose of this drone was to either chase after Batman, requiring you to break their ankles to escape, or perhaps it required Batman to chase after it instead. It's unclear what its purpose was for, but we know it likely exploded upon impact on Batman or some other target. What I do find interesting is that in terms of design, the Suicide Pursuit Drone looks nothing like a militia vehicle. So then, it's clear that the Suicide Pursuit Drone was connected to an entirely different villain or faction in the game. There are small indications that the drone somehow connected to the character Hush, but in what way is entirely unknown. Arkham Knight was a marvel when it first came out, incorporating a diverse set of mechanics that are revered by the gaming community. The systems were so well put together, and so much detail was put into these games that fans still discover exciting details about the game years after its release. If Rocksteady ever worked on another Arkham game at any point in the future, I doubt they would ever be able to surpass this achievement, as right now, Batman Arkham Knight remains the benchmark of how good superhero games can be when you put all your passion and effort into crafting a product that you and fans can respect.